The Bayou country of St. Tammany Parish, Louisiana, holds its secrets the way the Spanish moss holds the oak trees, quietly, patiently, and with a grip that does not loosen with the passing of ordinary time. On an overcast Thursday morning in the autumn of 1998, in the small community of Slidell, Louisiana, a woman named Cheryl Ann Fontenot stepped out of her front door, kissed her 2 young children goodbye, and walked to the edge of her gravel driveway to wave at the school bus. The driver remembered her. The neighbors remembered her. Her children remembered the color of the sweater she wore, a pale yellow one she had washed and folded herself the evening before. No one would see Cheryl Ann alive again, and the question that would haunt this community for the next 25 years was not simply where she went, but who among them already knew the answer. Cheryl Ann Fontenot was 34 years old in the fall of 1998. She had grown up in Bogalusa, Louisiana, the second of 4 children raised by a schoolteacher mother and a logging supervisor father who believed, above all things, in working hard and staying close to family. By the time Cheryl Ann was a young woman, she had done exactly what her parents had modeled. She had built a life of quiet, deliberate order. She worked as a medical billing specialist at Northshore Regional Medical Center, clocking in each weekday by 8 in the morning. She volunteered at her children's school on Tuesdays. She kept a garden along the south side of her house where she grew tomatoes and basil, and she made red sauce from scratch every Sunday. Her children were Marcus, 8 years old, who was obsessed with toy trucks and kept a collection of 11 of them lined up by the living room window, and Lily, 6, who carried a worn plush rabbit everywhere she went and called it Mr. Ears. Her husband, Dennis Roy Fontenot, was 37. He worked as a contractor with a small construction business. He operated out of a utility shed behind the house. Dennis was known around the parish as a man of strong opinions, a certain charm when he needed it, and a temperament that people who knew him well described in careful, measured words that stopped just short of something they seemed reluctant to say directly. The morning of Thursday, October 22, 1998, was cool by Louisiana standards, around 60 degrees, with a thin overcast sky that never quite committed to rain. Neighbors along Pinecrest Loop, the quiet residential street where the Fontenots lived, would later describe the morning as ordinary in every visible way. Across the street, Barbara Trosclair had been unloading groceries from her car around 7:45 in the morning. She saw Cheryl Ann at the end of the driveway, still wearing the pale yellow sweater over dark slacks, watching the school bus pull away. Cheryl Ann had waved not just to the bus but to Barbara across the street. A full wave, the kind you give someone you are glad to see. By 9:30 that same morning, Cheryl Ann had not arrived at work. Her supervisor, Janet Bro, said she tried calling the house twice before 10 o'clock. No answer. This was unusual enough to be noted. Cheryl Ann had a near-perfect attendance record and called whenever she was going to be even a few minutes late. By 11:15, Janet called again. Still no answer. She left a message. That evening, Dennis Roy Fontenot called the St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Office at approximately 6:47. He reported that his wife had not come home, that she had not called him, and that he could not reach her. The deputy who took the call noted Dennis's voice as calm, not the kind of calm that some people fall into during shock, but settled, measured, like a man recounting something that had happened to someone else. The deputy wrote in his initial report, "Caller was cooperative and composed, did not appear distressed, stated he assumed she had gone somewhere after work." That assumption would be the first of many things that would not hold. The Fontenot property sat on a half-acre lot. The backyard bordered a stretch of pine woods that ran for roughly 3 miles before connecting to a network of drainage ditches and low marsh terrain. The family car, A 1994 Dodge Caravan in Burgundy was still in the driveway when deputies arrived that evening. Cheryl Ann's purse was on the kitchen counter. Her keys were on the hook by the door. Her reading glasses, which she needed for driving, were on the nightstand beside the bed. The outdoor thermometer read 58 degrees. The pale yellow sweater was not in the house. Marcus's toy trucks were lined up by the window, exactly as he always kept them. Lily's rabbit sat on the kitchen table. The red sauce she had made the previous Sunday was still in a mason jar in the refrigerator. The swing in the backyard hung motionless. The toy truck Marcus had left on the back step lay on its side in the grass. By Friday morning, October 23, the St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Office had expanded its initial report into a full missing persons investigation. A ground search team consisting of 14 deputies and 2 tracking dogs was deployed into the pine woods behind the house by 9 that morning. Volunteers from the local fire station and a church auxiliary added another 30 people to the perimeter search by noon. The local paper, the Slidell Sentry, ran a photograph of Cheryl Ann on the front page by Saturday, a snapshot from her daughter's 6th birthday party just 3 months earlier, Cheryl Ann laughing with her arms around both children. The community response was significant. A command table was set up in the parking lot of the First Baptist Church on Gowes Boulevard. Handmade flyers went up in every gas station, grocery store, and laundromat within 20 miles. A tip line fielded 43 calls in the first 48 hours. None of them led anywhere concrete. The search team found nothing in the pine woods in the first pass. The drainage ditches were checked with poles. The marsh terrain was surveyed by 2 deputies in a flat-bottom boat. No clothing, no physical evidence, no trace. Investigators noted several inconsistencies in the first week that they documented in their reports, but did not yet speak publicly about. The first was the mileage on the family's second vehicle, a 1991 Ford pickup that Dennis used for work. According to Dennis, he had spent the afternoon and evening of October 22 at a job site in Lacombe, Louisiana, approximately 21 miles from the house. He said he had returned home around 6 in the evening and found the house empty. But the odometer reading that deputies recorded from the truck on the evening of October 23 did not match the mileage consistent with a single round trip to Lacombe. The discrepancy was not large, roughly 60 additional miles, but it was there, and investigators noted it quietly. The second inconsistency was the timeline Dennis provided. He stated he had spoken to Cheryl Ann by phone at approximately 12:30 in the afternoon on the day she disappeared. A quick call, he said, to ask about dinner. The phone records retrieved from the house's landline showed no outgoing or incoming calls between 10:45 in the morning and 6:50 in the evening. The cell phone network in that part of St. Tammany Parish in 1998 was limited, but the records were requested from the carrier regardless. They would take several weeks to arrive. Those who knew the Fontenots well spoke carefully to investigators. The women in Cheryl Ann's Tuesday volunteer group described her as warm but guarded in recent months. She didn't say anything directly, one of them told a deputy. But there were times she would go quiet in the middle of a conversation, and you'd see something cross her face, something she decided not to say. A neighbor 2 lots down said that he had heard raised voices coming from the Fontenot house on at least 2 separate occasions in the month before the disappearance. He had not reported it. He said he assumed it was a normal disagreement. He said this while looking at the ground. Deputies whispered quietly to one another about the fact that Dennis had not asked, in any of his interactions with investigators during the first week, where they thought she might have gone. He had answered every question put to him. He had signed the necessary paperwork. He had provided names of her friends and coworkers when asked. But he had not asked the questions that most people in his position could not stop asking. Whether there had been any sightings, whether the searchers had found anything in the woods, whether there was any indication of which direction she might have traveled. He was present at the command table at the church on Saturday morning for approximately 40 minutes. He spoke to the volunteers, thanked them, and left before the afternoon briefing. The lead investigator on the case, Detective Raymond Guidry of the St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Office, was a 16-year veteran who had worked missing persons cases throughout his career. He would say later, in a recorded interview conducted after the case was resolved, that by the end of the first week, he had a feeling he had learned to trust over many years. There are cases, he said, where the unknowns point outward toward a stranger, toward an accident, toward something that came from outside the family. And there are cases where the unknowns point inward. This one pointed inward from the beginning. The cell phone records arrived in mid-November. They showed no calls made or received on Cheryl Ann's number after 7:18 the previous evening, October 21, the night before she disappeared. The call log showed a 13-minute call to her mother in Bogalusa. Her mother remembered the call. She remembered that Cheryl Ann had sounded tired and that she had said, almost in passing, that she was looking forward to Thanksgiving. That was the last time anyone outside the household spoke to Cheryl Ann Fontenot. The investigation entered December with no body, no confirmed crime scene, no physical evidence, and a missing woman whose husband had provided a timeline that did not hold up in at least two measurable ways. Without a body, without a forensic finding, the case could not move to the next stage. Investigators knew what they suspected. Suspicion was not evidence. By January of 1999, the ground searches had concluded. The command table at the church had been taken down. The tip line had gone quiet. The flyers on the laundromat windows had been covered by new postings for other things. Detective Guidry kept the case file on his desk, not in a cabinet. He said it was the only way he knew to tell himself he had not forgotten. The months that followed Cheryl Ann's disappearance moved the way time moves in the aftermath of something that has no resolution, not forward exactly, but sideways, accumulating weight rather than distance. Dennis Fontenot remained in the house on Pinecrest Loop through the winter and into the spring of 1999. He hired a woman named Gloria, a retired school teacher who lived 2 streets over, to watch the children in the afternoons after school. The arrangement was practical. The neighbors observed it. No one said anything directly. Marcus turned 9 in March of 1999. He had stopped lining up his toy trucks by the window. Lily's rabbit, Mr. Ears, began appearing in unusual places, on top of the refrigerator, on the back porch, at the edge of the yard. When Gloria gently asked Lily why she kept moving it, the child said she was leaving it where her mother could find it when she came back. A counselor from the school district visited the house twice in the spring of 1999. In her notes, which were later reviewed as part of the reopened investigation, she wrote that Marcus had begun drawing houses in his school notebooks, not fantastical houses, but the family's actual house on Pinecrest Loop, drawn repeatedly, always from the same angle, always with the same detail. The back door open, and a figure standing just inside. When the counselor asked Marcus who the figure was, he said it was nobody. Then he said, after a long pause, that it was his mother waiting. By the summer of 1999, Gloria had begun to notice things. Dennis left the house early most mornings and returned late. He received phone calls he took outside or in the utility shed. He was not openly unkind to the children, but he was not present with them in the way that registers as attention. Gloria described watching him at dinner one evening and nodding that he did not speak to either child for the entirety of the meal. He sat there like he was somewhere else, she told investigators years later. Like he had already left, he just hadn't moved his body yet. For those who have ever doubted someone they love, turned a suspicion over in the mind late at night, examined it from every angle, and still found themselves unable to speak it aloud. The position of everyone who circled the Fontenot house in those months was not unfamiliar. The neighbors knew what they thought. The women from the Tuesday volunteer group knew what they thought. Gloria knew what she thought. But knowing and proving are separated by a distance that the law requires you to cross completely, and none of them had what was needed to cross it. Dennis filed paperwork in January of 2000 to have Cheryl Ann legally declared deceased in absentia, citing the passage of more than a year and the lack of any evidence of her survival. The Fontenot family in Bogalusa, Cheryl Ann's parents, her sisters, contested this through their attorney. The process became protracted. In the summer of 2000, Dennis Fontenot listed the house on Pinecrest Loop for sale. He moved with the children to Manville, Louisiana, roughly a 30-minute drive to the west, at the end of August 2000. He enrolled Marcus and Lily in new schools. He took on a larger construction project in Covington and, by all visible measures, rebuilt the surface of a life. The children were enrolled. The bills were paid. The utility shed at the new house contained the same tools Dennis had always kept, the same brands, the same order on the pegboard. Cheryl Ann's mother, Agnes Fontenot, drove to Slidell every year on October 22. She parked at the end of Pinecrest Loop and sat in her car for a while. She did not know exactly why she chose that specific act, except that it felt like the only thing she could do that acknowledged what had happened without pretending it was over. She did this every year from 1999 through 2020. Detective Guidry retired from the St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Office in 2009. Before he left, he made 3 personal requests to the sheriff: that the Fontenot file be kept accessible, that it be reviewed by his successor, and that the forensic evidence, what little existed, be retained and cataloged with attention to emerging technology. The sheriff agreed to all 3. The marriage between Dennis and a woman he had begun seeing in Manville around 2001 deteriorated by 2003. She would later tell investigators when the case reopened that she had ended the relationship because Dennis had a quality she could never name precisely. He could be standing right in front of you, she said, and you'd feel like there was a wall of glass between you and him. Like whatever you said, it bounced back. Like he was watching everything from somewhere you couldn't reach. She said she sometimes woke up in the night and found him standing at the bedroom window looking at the yard. He never offered an explanation. She never asked for one. She said she was afraid of the answer. Lily Fontenot turned 18 in 2010. She was living in Baton Rouge by that time, attending community college and working part-time at a pharmacy. She had not spoken to her father in over a year. She could not have said at that point exactly what had shifted or when. It was not a single moment, she would later tell investigators. It was more like a slow accumulation of things that never quite fit, things he said that didn't match things he had said before, gaps in stories about that day, expressions that crossed his face when her mother's name came up in conversation. Expressions that were not grief. She could not name what they were. They were simply not grief. Marcus Fontenot was living in Houston by 2015, working as an electrician. He had not been in contact with his father for 2 years. He had the drawing, one of the drawings from his 3rd grade notebook, framed and hung on the wall of his apartment. The house on Pinecrest Loop. The back door open. The figure inside. The breaking point came in the spring of 2022. Lily Fontenot, now 28, had been seeing a therapist for 2 years. In the course of those sessions, She had begun to work through memories that she had stored away in the particular way that children store things that are too large to process at the time, not forgetting them exactly, but placing them somewhere the mind does not look directly. In one of those sessions, she recalled something from the morning of October 22, 1998. She had been 6 years old. She remembered standing at the living room window after the school bus came and watching her father's truck pull out of the driveway. This was not unusual, but she remembered something else. The truck had pulled back in, less than 20 minutes later. She remembered seeing her father get out. She remembered that her mother was no longer in the yard. She remembered that her father had gone around the back of the house. She had not known, at 6 years old, what to make of this. She had filed it away in the part of the mind that holds the things a child cannot name. She called her brother that evening. They talked for 2 hours. Then she called the St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Office. The call from Lily Fontenot arrived at the St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Office on April 14, 2022, a Thursday, at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon. The deputy who took the call, following standard protocol, forwarded it within the hour to the cold case unit, which had been formally established in 2017 with dedicated staffing and expanded forensic resources. The Fontenot file, maintained in accessible storage exactly as Detective Guidry had requested before his retirement, was pulled from archive the following morning. The detective assigned to the cold case unit at that time was Sergeant Elaine Boudreau, a 12-year veteran of the sheriff's office who had worked 3 previously resolved cold cases, including one dating back to 1991. She reviewed the Fontenot file over the weekend of April 15 and 16, working from her home and making notes that she described later as filling in a shape that had already been there, but that no one had been able to touch. The initial trigger of Lily's testimony was only the beginning. Sergeant Boudreau identified 3 elements in the original 1999 file that had been documented but never fully pursued due to the case going cold before warrants could be obtained. The first was the odometer discrepancy on Dennis's truck. The second was the cell phone timeline. The third, the one that Boudreau flagged immediately, was a notation buried in a supplemental report from a canine handler who had participated in the October 24 search. The handler had noted that one of the tracking dogs had alerted strongly to a specific location, approximately 400 yards into the pine woods behind the house, near the bank of a drainage ditch. The dog had circled the area 3 times. The handler had flagged it for follow-up excavation. The follow-up had never occurred. The case had slowed and then stopped before the excavation could be scheduled. On April 19, 2022, Sergeant Boudreau submitted a formal case reopening request to the St. Tammany Parish District Attorney's Office. It was approved within 48 hours. A joint team comprising the Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit, the Louisiana State Police Forensic Division, and 2 forensic anthropologists from Tulane University was assembled by the end of April. Excavation at the site near the drainage ditch began on May 3, 2022, a Tuesday. The site, more than 23 years after the original search, had changed significantly. Trees had grown. The ditch banks had shifted with decades of seasonal flooding, and the undergrowth was dense. The forensic team worked in a methodical grid pattern, removing layers of soil with brushes and trowels. On the 3rd day of excavation, May 5, anthropologists identified the first skeletal remains approximately 60 centimeters below the current ground surface. By the end of May 7, the recovery was complete. Dental records confirmed the identity of the remains as Cheryl Ann Fontenot on May 12, 2022. She had been in those woods, 400 yards from the home where her children had grown up, for 24 years. The forensic examination of the remains was conducted over the following weeks. Due to the condition of the evidence after more than 2 decades in the ground, the forensic team worked with what they had. Their findings, detailed in a report submitted to the district attorney in June 2022, indicated skeletal trauma consistent with blunt force, identified in the cranial region. The report was careful and precise in its language, as forensic reports are required to be, but the conclusion was unambiguous. Cheryl Ann Fontenot had not walked into those woods and disappeared. She had been placed there. Dennis Roy Fontenot was living in a 2-bedroom house in Bayou, St. Louis, Mississippi, by May of 2022. He was 61 years old. He was working as a general contractor, still operating the same kind of small construction business he had maintained his entire adult life. He had no criminal record. He attended a local church. His neighbors described him as quiet, self-sufficient, and private. He had a dog. On June 9, 2022, at 7:14 in the morning, Sergeant Elaine Boudreau and 2 deputies from the St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Office, accompanied by Mississippi law enforcement officers, arrived at Dennis Fontenot's residence in Bayou, St. Louis. He answered the door in work clothes. He looked at them without surprise, or at least without anything that read, to the investigators present, as surprise. Sergeant Boudreau described his expression in her arrest report as still. Not blank, not afraid, not angry. Still. As though he had been waiting for this moment to arrive and had spent a long time deciding what face to wear when it did. He was handcuffed on his front porch at 7:19. He was transported to the Harrison County Sheriff's Office before being extradited to Louisiana. He did not speak during the arrest. He did not ask why they were there. He did not ask what they had found. The arrest of Dennis Roy Fontenot for the first-degree homicide of his wife Cheryl Ann Fontenot was made public by the St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Office in a press release issued at noon on June 9, 2022. By afternoon, the story had been picked up by local television stations in New Orleans and the surrounding region. By evening, it had reached national outlets. The community of Slidell and the wider St. Tammany Parish absorbed the news in the particular way that communities absorb a long-deferred answer to a question they had always been afraid to ask directly. Those who had known Dennis and had harbored private doubts for 2 decades described a complicated feeling, not satisfaction, which would have been too simple, but something closer to relief mixed with a heaviness that acknowledgement brings. The neighbor who had heard raised voices 24 years ago said he had thought about it, probably once a month, every month, since she disappeared. The women from the Tuesday volunteer group held an impromptu gathering at one of their homes that evening. They did not celebrate. They sat together and some of them cried and some of them did not, and all of them held the fact that a woman they had known and liked and never done enough to protect had been in the ground 400 yards from her own kitchen, while life continued above her. There were those who had known Dennis in Bayou, St. Louis who expressed disbelief. They described him as a good neighbor, a reliable contractor, a man who kept to himself in a way that read to them as simple privacy. A man who went to church. A man with a dog. These responses were not wrong exactly. They described what had been visible. What they did not describe was what had been beneath the visible surface for 24 years. Lily Fontenot was in Baton Rouge when the arrest was made. She was notified by Sergeant Boudreau personally, by phone, at 7:30 in the morning. She sat with the information for a moment in silence before she spoke. She said, "She was there this whole time." It was not a question. Sergeant Boudreau, who had investigated difficult cases for 12 years and was not given to sentiment in professional settings, said later that this was the moment in the case that she returned to most often. Marcus Fontenot was at a job site in Houston. He left when he got the call and drove to his apartment. He took the drawing off the wall, the one from third grade, the house on Pinecrest Loop with the back door open and the figure inside, and held it for a long time. Agnes Fontenot, Cheryl Ann's mother, was 81 years old in June of 2022. She had driven to Slidell every October 22 for 23 years and sat in her car at the end of Pinecrest Loop. When her daughter called with the news of the arrest, Agnes said very little. She asked one question: did she suffer? The forensic team's assessment, communicated as gently as possible through the district attorney's victim services coordinator, indicated that the injuries were severe and likely rapid. Agnes accepted this with the particular composure of a woman who had spent 24 years preparing herself for whatever the truth turned out to be. Dennis Roy Fontenot entered a plea of not guilty at his arraignment in St. Tammany Parish on July 8, 2022. He appeared in the courtroom in a gray suit, his hair white now, his posture exactly as it had always been: upright, measured, contained. He stood at the defense table while the charges were read and showed nothing. The courtroom gallery, which included members of the Fontenot family from Bogalusa, several of Cheryl Ann's former colleagues, and two of the women from the Tuesday volunteer group, watched him with the accumulated attention of more than 2 decades. As of the time of this account, the case remained in pretrial proceedings, with a trial date scheduled for 2024. The legal process, as it always does, continued at its own pace, subject to its own requirements, answerable to its own standards. The evidence gathered by Sergeant Boudreau's team, combined with the forensic findings from the excavation, the cellular records from 1998, the odometer documentation, and Lily Fontenot's testimony regarding what she witnessed as a 6-year-old child on the morning of October 22, 1998, formed the foundation of the prosecution's case. The defense would mount its arguments in due time. The courtroom would hear what it would hear. The standard of reasonable doubt would be applied with the rigor that the law demands. None of that changes what was found in the Pine Woods on May 7, 2022, 60 centimeters below the surface of ground that had held its secret for 24 years. There is something particular about a cold case that resolves, not the resolution itself, which is always incomplete in some way that the living must simply learn to carry, but the long interval between. The 24 years that elapsed between October 22, 1998, and the morning of June 9, 2022, were not empty years. They were years in which Cheryl Ann Fontenot's mother drove to Slidell every October and sat in her car. Years in which a little girl left a stuffed rabbit at the edge of the yard so her mother could find it. Years in which a boy drew the same house, the same door, the same figure, over and over in school notebooks, because the mind of a child knows things that it cannot yet name, and does the only thing it can with them. It draws them and keeps them and waits. Justice in a case like this is not a clean thing. It does not restore what was taken. It does not give Marcus and Lily their childhood back, or give Agnes Fontenot the years of knowing rather than wondering, or give Cheryl Ann another Sunday making red sauce in her kitchen. What it does, and it is not nothing, is speak the truth out loud in a formal place with evidence before a record that will outlast everyone in that courtroom. It says, she was here. She was real. What happened to her was not acceptable, and it was not forgotten, and the weight of it did not dissolve simply because time kept passing. The swing still hangs behind the house on Pinecrest Loop, long since replaced by whoever bought the property after the Fontenots left. The toy truck Marcus left on the back step is gone, but the children who lived there grew up, and they remembered, and one of them finally said the thing out loud that she had been carrying since she was 6 years old in a yellow-carpeted living room, watching her father's truck back into the driveway on an ordinary October morning. Cheryl Ann Fontenot was 34 years old. She made red sauce on Sundays. She waved at her neighbor across the street. She kissed her children goodbye. She deserved to come home. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share this episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.